Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching my stories, I unearth tons of intriguing historical information that does not end up in my stories. So I've created this channel so I can share those tidbits with you. I really appreciate you stopping by to watch. In the last episode of Moments in History, I shared about Army flight nurses who served in the 31 evacuation squadrons to transport more than 1 million patients. In March of 1943, the Combat Air Transport Command formally established a joint medical section comprised of Army and Navy flight surgeons to supervise and select casualties for air evacuation in that theater. Navy nurses Stephanie Kozak and Mary Kane attended this school at Bowman Field in June of 1943, becoming the Navy's first flight nurses. In January of 1944, Kozak and Kane were joined by Flight Nurse Lieutenant J.G. Delphinian Van Gorp on a mission to Brazil to establish a, quote, aeromedical evacuation program, unquote, with the Brazilian Air Force Nurse Corps. Then, when the need for flight nurses in the Pacific War became apparent, the U.S. Navy established its own school of air evacuation, Casualties at Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, in 1944. Overseeing the school was a former United Airlines stewardess and registered nurse named Mary Ellen O'Connor, later dubbed the most flyingest woman in the world for her long career aboard airplanes. Miss O'Connor was a nurse turned stewardess at United at a time when stewardesses were required to be registered nurses. At the time of her entry into the Navy, she had already flown more than 2,500,000 miles. In addition to holding a nursing degree, applicants to the school were required to have good character, references, and be excellent swimmers. During training, the nurses studied academic subjects such as aeromedical physiology, the impact of treating patients at high altitudes. They also learned field survival, map reading, camouflage, ditching and crash procedures, and the use of a parachute. The program also included calisthenics, physical conditioning, and a bivouac in the field with simulated enemy attack. The first class of 24 nurses and 24 pharmacist mates graduated January 22, 1945. Half of those nurses were sent to the Naval Station in Agana, Guam, to prepare for their first battlefield mission, while the others were used to transport casualties from within the continental United States and from Hawaii. From March 6th to March 21st, 1945, flight nurses air evac'd some 2,393 Marines and sailors from Iwo Jima. In a recent telephone interview, Mary Hudnall, one of the first flight nurses on that island, recalled one patient being so grateful of his rescue, he insisted on giving her a memento from the battlefield. She says, "He asked me to take a small medicine bottle, and he told me it's sand from Iwo Jima. I don't want you to forget what we did here," end quote. When he fell asleep, she tucked the trinket under his blanket. However, when he awoke, he begged her to take it. As of April 2013, Hudnall still had this souvenir and still remembered the sacrifice of the men on Iwo. By the end of March, 2 more classes graduated from the school for a total of 74 trained flight nurses, almost all of whom would be used for the next big challenge, and perhaps the biggest of them all, Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa alone accounted for 17% of the total Navy and Marine casualties suffered during World War II. Owing to the enormous casualty totals, Okinawa was the largest combat casualty evacuation operation in U.S. military history and marked the very first time that the Navy evacuated more casualties by air rather than sea. It could take a ship 8 to 10 days to transport casualties from Okinawa to Guam, versus a flight which would take only 8 hours. On April 7, 1945, 6 days after the invasion, Ensign Jane Kende landed on Okinawa. marking the first time in history that a Navy flight nurse appeared on an active Pacific battlefield. Kende may have become a symbol for casualty evacuation and high-altitude nursing on that day, but she was far from alone on this daring mission. She and her fellow nurses, using the Douglas R-5D airplane, which could accommodate up to 60 patient litters, would help evacuate 11,771 wounded men to Guam. Navy flight nurse Millie Pottinger was stationed on Guam, and during a PBS interview, she shared that of the 108 Navy flight nurses that were out there, 42 were stationed on Okinawa. Conditions were challenging. The women lived in Quonset huts with one light bulb that hung from the middle of the ceiling. There was no running water, so they collected rainwater for laundry and showering, and they shared the outhouse with the captain. A limited number of cots meant the woman took what was available after returning to the base after an evacuation flight. Sometimes that meant the floor. The planes island hopped until eventually reaching their destination of Hawaii. If a nurse was not available to relieve the nurse on board, she would have to continue to the next stop. Once she'd been relieved, she would head back to Guam, where she would await her next mission. As mentioned, conditions were primitive with only the basic supplies provided. So, if a nurse made it all the way to Honolulu, as Nurse Pottinger put it, she'd commandeer a jeep and head to the grocery store where she'd stock up and take all the items she could back to Guam. Many soldiers in the Japanese Army did not surrender when the Allies took Guam, so the nurses were under constant guard. The women were not allowed to go anywhere alone, and a typical escort consisted of 2 armed soldiers. Curfew was 10 o'clock p.m. and strictly adhered to. The nurses were still on Guam on VJ Day and continued to do their job until everyone had been evacuated. Many of the nurses were then used to repatriate the prisoners of war from the Philippines to Guam. A few who stayed in the service years after the war would participate in the Berlin airlift. Later, Ensign Kende would remark about her service, "Our rewards are wan smiles, a slow nod of appreciation, a gesture, a word. Accolades greater, more heartwarming than any medal." I hope you've enjoyed today's moment in history. If you want to learn even more history, please stop by my blog, found at www.lindashentonmatchett.com. Please consider subscribing to my channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications of new episodes that release on the 2nd and 4th Friday of each month. Thank you again for watching, and have a great rest of your week.